I'm going to be talking a little bit about work that I was involved in both in San Diego at the Museum of Us and here in Ohio. I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the living nations of the Shawnee, Wyandot, Delaware, Potawatomi, Miami, Seneca, Ottawa, and Peoria. Nations no longer based in Ohio due to their forced relocation in the 1830s. Our field, like many others, is reckoning with and recognizing the disparities and assumptions that were sewn into it from its inception during the age of exploration and industrial expansion. Every age had its champions for equity and inclusion, and every age had its understanding of what those concepts meant. Today, the roles of systemic racism and colonization in the formation of museums, their contemporary practices and workplace cultures has risen to prominence in our internal conversations. I hope we're at a tipping point. Time will tell if the recent focus on more inclusive and decolonial practices in many museums is part of a flare-up, time-limited and ignited by the larger context of racial justice advocacy in our communities. I'm hopeful that we're in the early phases of a new period, where inclusive leaders at all levels of our institutions and those working in related areas are actually repairing and resetting museums so that they can model the values and practices required for humans and all beings to prosper. What is needed is a community of practice. Success is amplified by relationships, by the inclination of so many practitioners to share and invite, and seed and seed. My friend Noel Kahanu called the work of inclusion seeding authority. Any success I have experienced in inclusive and decolonial museum practice was seeded by others. If I started naming the museum practitioners, like my former coworker Brandy McDonald, who taught and teaches me how to do this work and who co-created pathways for shared authority and inclusion, I would fill my full 15 minutes. I know my comadres on this panel well enough to say that we all carry with us the ideas and brilliance of hundreds of people with whom we have worked, learned from, listened to, and watched in action. And now you all are part of this new museum community of practice. Understanding the full impact of settler and global colonization is work that requires ongoing self-reflection and truth-telling. Museums in the US and abroad are recognizing that this can only authentically occur in a context of truthfulness and transparency about the ways that our museums participated in the colonial enterprise. For the greater part of our history, we harmed Indigenous communities by participating in the extraction of their belongings, cultural practices, and bodies in service to the museum's goals of preservation and education. Moving beyond our legacies as colonial institutions requires a re-examination of the ethics of collecting, stewardship, and holding of Indigenous tangible and intangible culture and ancestral remains. The law is not sufficient to these ends, as lawcraft establishes only minimum standards for guiding museums. An ethical standard, legally compliant, but with a high bar for how museums provide value to a society, is what is required of museums today. The critical examination we undertook at the Museum of Us and at the Ohio History Connection revealed that these organizations acquired the bodies and belongings of Indigenous people in the United States and globally in ways that were legal, but not just or equitable. In San Diego, a surface level examination of acquisition ledgers showed hundreds of legal donations and purchases over the course of a century that filled storage rooms with tens of thousands of heritage items. However, a closer examination of those transactions revealed a more complex story. Apache belongings legally donated by a local couple, for example, in the 1950s, were originally taken by US soldiers stationed on the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona during the Apache Wars, a period of violent conflict and forced relocation between the US government and the Apache people. Another grouping of items were collected by members of the Stanley Porteous exhibitions in Australia. Not noted in the records is the fact that Porteous studied Aboriginal Australian communities in order to bolster his white supremacist racial theories. This is the norm for most non-tribal museums holding Indigenous cultural resources. The specific conditions under which belongings left those communities and the larger societal factors at play during historic periods of large-scale acquisition do not show up in standard collections documentation. Museums identify items with a donor name or purchase acknowledgement and display them in galleries, effectively erasing the genocide, warfare, displacement, and oppression perpetuated against Indigenous communities. Furthermore, by rarely including Indigenous voice in decisions made about the presentation of their ancestors and belongings, our institutions perpetuated the ongoing colonization and appropriation of Indigenous cultures. Faced with this truth about our role in the ongoing colonial oppression of Indigenous communities in San Diego and in Ohio, we began the process of decolonizing our institutional practices. In line with Ho-Chunk scholar Amy Lonetree's work in her seminal book, Decolonizing Museums from 2012, the Museum of Us and the Ohio History Connection are aiming to do three things. One, include Indigenous decision-making at all levels of the organization. Two, truthfully address the histories and legacies of colonization in their policies, practices, exhibits, and programs. And three, present the work of Indigenous scholars, traditional knowledge holders, and creatives. At the Museum of Us and at the Ohio History Connection, we chose to begin a decolonizing process by addressing internal policies and practices so that our outward-facing initiatives would be built on a foundation of deep institutional commitment to change. We had all experienced working in museums where outward-facing partnerships with Indigenous entities, usually in the form of exhibitions or educational and public programs, masked internal colonized structures and power disparities. True partnering, in our view, requires balanced power. In San Diego, we recognize that perhaps the greatest imbalance in the museum-Indigenous relationship is caused by the museum's claim of ownership over their ancestors' bodies and belongings. And so the staff at the museum there began our work with policies related to collections, what they now refer to as cultural resources, in recognition of their true value as resources for Indigenous cultural communities and continuity, and not as the possessions of collectors. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a federal law that was passed in 1991, and other international conventions passed in the last century, curtail or forbid the extraction of Indigenous bodies and belongings without consent in this era. However, NAGPRA law applies only to ancestral remains, funerary objects, sacred items, and items of cultural patrimony from federally recognized tribes within the United States. Other international conventions do not require current standards to be retroactively applied, as in the case of conventions governing import and export of certain archaeological and cultural items. Furthermore, implementation of NAGPRA legislation places decision-making authority for repatriation with the collecting institution and not with Indigenous communities. Standards of evidence required for the return of ancestral bodies or cultural items are often insurmountable for American Indian communities, and the legislation does not provide adequate recourse for communities seeking to obtain the return of their belongings. The Museum of Us and the Ohio History Connection, like most other museums that hold Indigenous items, had long prevented the return of ancestral remains and cultural resources to Indigenous communities. They had complied minimally in most cases with the letter of NAGPRA and benefited from both the procedural disparity written into that law and the limited number of communities with which they were compelled to consult. In order to shift from reluctant, minimal compliance with laws that were seen as a threat to the institution, it required internal policies and procedures that prioritized Indigenous community needs. These policies buttressed the framework of existing law. In 2018, the Museum of Us passed its Colonial Pathways policy. Building on the work of their colleagues at Te Papa Tangarawa, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the Abbey Museum, and others, a legally compliant but ethically mandated standard was applied at the Museum of Us that required continuing consent for stewarding Indigenous bodies and belongings. For many years, museums have held the power to set the bar for approving the return of Indigenous belongings or ancestors to Indigenous communities. In many instances, museums believed they were qualified to determine whether a community need was legitimate. The panelists here today hold that decolonization requires dominant culture institutions like the Museum of Us and the Ohio History Connection to let go of their presumed authority in relation to Indigenous decision-making and to recognize the authority of Indigenous communities. In practice, this means recognizing the validity of Indigenous definitions of ownership, acknowledging Western secularization of sacred items, and accepting traditions of continuity between Indigenous peoples past and present. At the Ohio History Connection, Stacy Halfmoon, the former director of American Indian Relations, led the process of drafting an American Indian policy passed by the Board of Trustees in 2019 that recognizes the sovereignty of the 45 federally recognized tribes whose ancestors lived on the lands called Ohio. The policy requires consultation for the management of American Indian sites, cultural resources, ancestors, and for education and interpretation efforts. The Colonial Pathways Policy at the Museum of Us and the American Indian Policy in Ohio recognize Indigenous sovereignty and the legitimacy of Indigenous knowledge and shared narratives, whether documented or passed through oral traditions. These museums finally recognize that Indigenous knowledge is the most reliable evidence when defining the importance of cultural resources to an Indigenous community. Prioritizing Indigenous knowledge and decisions allows museums that draft and implement similar policies to begin to correct the harm created by non-Indigenous authorities who disregarded their expertise. Implementing these policies will be the work of our museums for the next several decades. In San Diego, about 80% of the museum's approximately 75,000 ethnographic items and archival and audiovisual materials, as well as all the archaeology for more than 1,000 sites, will require consultation with descendant communities. This work will take time, given their capacity. At the Ohio History Connection, with more than 25 historic sites and museums across the state that interpret American Indian histories and culture, we hold the remains of more than 9,000 American Indian ancestors and hundreds of thousands of ancient American Indian belongings. Our most recent strategic plan anticipates a decade to complete the repatriation work under NAGPRA alone. However, these two institutions have embraced this restorative justice work as the work moving forward. They will remain museums that serve their communities through explorations of ideas and issues that impact us all, providing a fuller historical context for understanding the colonial enterprise and the strength and resilience of Indigenous peoples. My colleagues on this panel will demonstrate how our work to decolonize our practices will lead to new concepts and stories that we can interpret in programs and exhibitions. This is our work moving forward, and it moves at the speed of repairing the world. It moves at the speed of ceding authority. In the words of Adrienne Marie Brown, it moves at the speed of trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So it's my turn. Halito chokma sanofa Brandy McDonald chakasasea chatasea. Hello, my name is Brandon McDonald. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation and also Scottish heritage. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you all. I think, let me just a second. As they had mentioned earlier, I'm the Director of Decolonizing Initiatives at what was formerly the San Diego Museum of Ben, but is now the Museum of Us. This is our building. If you have a look at our building, it is a monument to the colonizer. It has colonizers etched into the skin. The birth of the museum was through colonization, and the museum has contributed and benefited from the colonial endeavor. We also sit on the ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. The Kumeyaay are the indigenous peoples of this land. I also think it's really important for us to recognize that we are all on indigenous land. We may be in little boxes inside of Zoom, but we're in different areas within the world, and it's still indigenous land. And so recognizing that indigenous people continue to maintain their connection to the land and are stewards of this land, and for many communities continue to maintain their tribal sovereignties and their rights to self-determination. As Ben had mentioned, this is the footprint of our museum. I wanted to just show this really quick. We have 75 ethnographic objects, and we represent hundreds of indigenous communities around the world. And Ben also mentioned this a little bit too, so I'm not going to spend too much time because I don't want to repeat what Ben so wonderfully said, but these are our guiding principles where we talk about truth telling. So a lot of our decolonial work that is guided through this pathway, these pathways. There's one that's not represented on here that I need to add, which is reciprocity, and really thinking about what reciprocity means and how we can continue to share this work and share this knowledge with community members and continue to hopefully build this work within the field to create transformative positive change, both as a field structure, but also for the next generation of museum educators or museum peoples just coming into this space. The work that we do at the museum, we see it in two spaces to create entire systemic change. When we look at policy and we look at practice. And I know this is a beefy slide. It's got a lot of words on it. I'm not going to go into all of them. And Ben also mentioned a lot of these different pieces, but I really wanted to focus on one. Noelle and I are going to talk a little bit about some tangible examples of the work and what it looks like. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about with the museum is Google Arts and Culture and how that came to be, and then also show you an example of our Google Arts and Culture. And so if you don't know about Google Arts and Culture, it's this wonderful platform. It reaches a global audience. It has a network of different types of opportunities where you engage in museums, place, artworks. Our organization has been thinking and talking and discussing about Google Arts and Culture for some time. And we've always sit in the space to where we didn't feel like it was right for us because specifically with museums, it being Google Arts and Culture, highly focused on objects and material culture and what you had within your collections or your cultural resources space. And that is not the museum. That's not where our decolonial work centers. We really take a step back and recognize that these cultural resources, these pieces of material culture, the ancestors, that they're not ours as a museum, that they have been stolen and taken, that these cultural resources, many of these items are in a state of diaspora, and that they should be going home. And if we do put something on display or a cultural resource on display, it should be through the permission and also network and relationship through the indigenous communities, that they decide how it's on display, what is said by it. And so that can be a counter if we haven't had those consultations and talked and discussed about what that looks like and having that on an international platform like Google Arts and Culture, it creates a different paradigm. And so we've always erred on the side of no. But then the pandemic hit and everything shut down, and we started to have these conversations again, and this was brought up. And so we decided that it couldn't hurt to have a conversation. And this was through the support of our board members who also had networks and were connected to Google Arts and Culture. So several of our team members sat down with Google Arts and Culture, and they're wonderful team members. And we had a conversation about, this is what we stand for. We can't fit within the box of how the typical museums present themselves within Google Arts and Culture. But we think that it's great, but it's just not us because of our decolonial work. And we had a very long conversation. It was back and forth. Well, what do you think about this? Could you do this? I was saying, no, actually that doesn't fit with our work because it's a decolonial, like we don't want to replicate colonial harm. What happened was we came to a space to where we both agreed, us and Google Arts and Culture, that we could do something different and do something that fits within a decolonial paradigm that continues to align with our commitment to Indigenous communities. And so we would see what we can do. We also explored inside of Google Arts and Culture. They have this space where you're supposed to have all of your collection. And I'll show you, this is our page for Google Arts and Culture. And so what it is you're supposed to have around 87 to 137 collections. And typically with museums, this collection are images of the objects within your cultural resources or collections department. Well, we really pushed the definition of what that item is, and asked kind of, well, what is it just a picture of something? Could it be a picture of our building? Could it be a picture of a sign? We found out that the initial reaction to what item is actually had a broader definition that we ended up being able to fit into and also negotiate through. And so essentially it was photos. And so the discussion that we wanted to have was, what kind of exhibit do we feel aligns with our decolonial processes, and also is authentic to our commitment to the community, commitment to doing better, commitment to Indigenous communities. And so our first exhibit that I'm going to show you is the exhibit, Our Colonial Legacies, the museum facade. The reason that we really leaned into this one being the first one is we took a step back and we paused and we asked, what does the community want us to do? And a couple of folks were like, well, let's have an anti-racism exhibit. Let's have an exhibit about one of the exhibits that we have on display. And one of the things that we kept coming back to was that the community asked us about our facade, and Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities said, we need to talk about the colonizers on the facade because we don't have an exhibit about it. It's just been there, people taking selfies, and we've never really been honest about who these colonizers are. And so this was a space where we could lean in and talk about it and give the truthful story about who these people are. And so I'm going to show you a few bits and pieces, maybe, of our Google Arts and Culture exhibit. And here's the link as well, and I can share it within the chat later if you all are interested in looking at it. But this is your entry page, and I'm going to scoot through this fairly fast and just kind of give some of the highlights that I think are really important. And we wanted to make sure that within this exhibit, each part of our exhibit, we were staying true to being accountable to our colonial legacy, being accountable to our past and our present, and the ways in which that we have replicated colonial harm, continued to perpetrate colonial harm and trauma, both intentionally and unintentionally, both through the words in our exhibits on display and just the building that we are housed in. And so we have, this is one of our, I think it's like the third slide in, that is recognizing and us being accountable to the ways in which that we have been an eraser of Indigenous voices and the ways that we have not listened to Indigenous people, and that through the dominant narrative that we've continued to perpetuate, or not even just say anything at all around the colonizers in the facade, that we've contributed to colonization or the colonial endeavor. We also wanted to really set a space, because a lot of people don't know the history of our building, don't know that we as an institution don't own the building. And so we wanted to create this timeline, this large exhibit that shows both the construction of the building, talking about that this land is not barren. It was never barren. Indigenous people lived on this land. That Balboa Park, the beautiful park that we live in, was actually made, but was a product, or it was a catalyst for displacement of Indigenous peoples in their land. We also wanted to give recognition and make sure that we were showing the interconnectivity of different colonial pieces throughout time, especially thinking about the doctrine of discovery, thinking about the significance of colonial Catholic structures and the impact and the power that Catholicism had. Sorry, my dog is now barking because he's not, the postman, our post person is coming. So we wanted to make sure that we were showing this piece as well, so that our building represents so much more, even just by the Spanish colonial iconography on the building. So this is the space where we really go in. And so within our exhibit, we dive in to the 9 colonizers. And so we show them. They are, I think it's 8 Spanish colonizers and 1 who is from the UK, British colonizer George Vancouver. I'm just going to show a couple of highlights. And I know that this print is really small, but what I wanted to show was one of the things that we really tried to achieve is showing both historical images, showing images of spaces that people are familiar with, that are consistently honoring the colonizers and the colonizer story, and uplifting this false narrative of the ways in which that they came and saved this barren land or worked directly with Indigenous communities. So this one is an example of Cabrillo, where we talk about the bridge that people come over every day to get into the park is named after Cabrillo, who is a colonizer on our space. We also talk about how one of the major highways that people drive every day, 163, was actually named Cabrillo Highway for a period of time, that the national monument, Cabrillo National Monument. And then we also show pictures and images of the beach that people go to all the time. So just really kind of bringing in, bringing in both present day images and then historical images to show the connection and the intersectionality of the ways in which we uplift. We also wanted to talk about the importance of renaming spaces, where they talk about how San Diego Bay was named, and the reasoning behind San Diego, the reasoning behind renaming something from the indigenous name as a way of erasing indigenous people's territorial claim. And this is the same thing. So I just wanted to show other examples where we talk about the land, we talk about the forceful removal of Kumeyaay people, chasing Kumeyaay people down and forcefully assimilating indigenous people and what that looks like. Also of these spaces that people are going to and that are celebrating the missionaries, but all talking about the harm that these missions have caused to indigenous people throughout the history. Oops. Same thing, George Vancouver. This is another part where we have several people who are several of the men that are on our facade that it just says they made maps and charts in a lot of the history books, but really diving into the significance of what maps and charts does. It is a piece of propaganda. It was an access. It is an open doorway that allowed more people to come in, allowed more assimilation, more genocide. And so continuing to make sure that we're talking about those tools of pieces of propaganda and the effects that they've had on indigenous populations and the land. We end with reflection questions. So we have, it's about 6 reflection questions, and there are a variety of reflection questions that any age group can engage in, both from whose land do you live on, and the website where you can look to see whose indigenous land you live on, diving into what are some of the places and the buildings, what are they named in your area, and doing some reflection on that. Also thinking about, now that you know more about colonization, especially colonization in this area, what can you do to uplift Black, Indigenous people of color's histories and voices? And then we also wanted to make sure that people were like, what are your sources? This is bogus. Brandy's making this up out of like thin air, is to show that there are resources and many resources out there, but here are some of the major resources that we used in order to create this this piece of educational Google Arts and Culture. And so we wanted to make sure that when we were talking about the resources that we have, that there were different types of engagement points, both from books to dissertations to an article that they could find, memoirs, so that it wasn't just one form of ways of finding pieces of information about the history of Southern California and the people who are the colonizers that are represented on our facade. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to pass it to Noelle, who I have so much respect for, and I feel so honored to be on the panel with both her and Ben Garcia. And I'm excited to hear Noelle talk a bit about your experience and repatriation.
Mahalo for that, Brandy, and for Ben. And thank you so much to ASU and LACMA and the fellowship program for inviting us here today. So I am going to go ahead and start sharing. Okay, so aloha mai kako o wau Noel Maile Kaluhea Yayoi Kahanu. I'm really happy to be here with all of you, really to share space with colleagues who are engaged in such critically important and transformative work. Over the course of the next few minutes, I'll be taking you all on a journey, which resulted in a number of decolonial outcomes. In 2014, I traveled to England with a friend, Native Hawaiian artist and professor Maile Andrade. She'd been invited to serve on an advisory board for Pacific Presences, and they were engaged in creating a major Pacific exhibition. So they'd be having a meeting and a conference, and I became her +1. So I had never been to Cambridge, England before, and it was there that we encountered the colonial beast, where it was born, where it was nurtured, where it emanated from, expanded outward, and replicated itself. Signs noted that the University of Cambridge had recently celebrated its 800th birthday. 8 centuries of Western scholarship, which included collecting, studying, and interpreting the world through their academic and largely white male privileged eyes. We encountered the Royal Academy of Arts in London, swiftly approaching its own 250th anniversary, which coincided with Cook's voyages across the Pacific. That is where the grand exhibition was planned to open in 2018. But we also encountered each other. We were a few in number, but we represented many. Indigenous folks from Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, Aotearoa, and Hawaii. Unbeknownst to me, however, there were even more of us in Cambridge than I realized. 20 ancestral Native Hawaiians were held in the bowels of the Cambridge Duckworth Laboratory, residing among some 18,000 others in what is one of the largest repositories of human remains in the world. The conference provided the opportunity for repatriation advocate and activist Halealoha Ayau to come to Cambridge. And the two of us walked over to Duckworth, where we met men, women, young, old, those whose po'o or heads had been stolen from their lands and families, all between 1860 and 1903. We were the first Hawaiians to hold them, to speak to them in more than a century. We also met with the Cambridge University Registrary and one of their attorneys. And in true colonial fashion, Cambridge argued that these kupuna were of great scientific value, while simultaneously maintaining that there was insufficient evidence to prove that they were Hawaiian at all. It was a contested meeting where Halealoha called them intellectual savages. And he later followed this with a gift of a box of chocolate-covered macadamia nuts. So we had learned to not be hostile all the time. Thus began over 5 years of research to prove that these ancestors were undoubtedly Native Hawaiian. But back to 2014, it was an opportunity for the few of us that were there to get to know each other better. Being in a foreign land in the belly of the beast created a solidarity among us. And we often stayed up late into the night, conspiring over coffee or beer, sharing our successes, our failures, rare natives working in the trenches of Western institutions. It was at one such meeting when a curator from Te Papa Tongareva Museum in New Zealand suggested that the time might have come for us to ask for Kalaniʻopuʻu's cloak back. Now, this was perhaps the most famous feathered cloak in the world. It bore witness to the moment of Europe's first encounter with Hawaii in 1778, when High Chief Kalaniʻopuʻu threw his own ahu'ula over Captain Cook's shoulders. This fledgling talk led to community and institutional conversations, which led to even more talks. And unbelievably, 2 years later, in 2016, Te Papa Museum agreed to a 10-year loan of Kalaniʻopuʻu's chiefly adornments. The ceremonies and protocols at Te Papa and Bishop were conducted almost exclusively in Maori and Hawaiian. The mana was stratospheric. The world shook and it emanated from Oceania. Last year, Te Papa's board perfected the loan to the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and Bishop Museum. And Kalaniʻopuʻu is now permanently home. What makes this a decolonial act? That decision-making occurred not because of its colonial context, but in spite of it. Issues of provenance, of legal ownership mattered less than the fact that what left Hawaii by an act of Pacific generosity was returned by an act of Pacific generosity. Ethics, humanity, mana, relationships, that was what mattered. As many said, it was the right thing to do. We also knew that it was not just Kalaniʻopuʻu's belongings that were present. He himself had been made manifest. Now, organizers of the Oceania exhibition were keenly aware of the celebrated return of Kalaniʻopuʻu's cloak, and in a moment of irony, put out feelers, might the cloak travel to England to be put on display to highlight this profound moment of encounter. So my response was that they should commission the creation of a new cloak, along with an explanation that Kalaniʻopuʻu's ahu'ula was finally home where it truly belonged. While this suggestion didn't go anywhere, the curators did invite my participation on other aspects of the exhibition, including contributing a catalog essay, providing information on feathered god images for the audio guide, and agreeing to place a malo or loincloth on our god Ku. The exhibition Oceania opened to great fanfare and celebration at the Royal Academy in London in 2018. After a highly successful run, its closing was to coincide with a conference, and I was invited to share my exhibition response alongside the two curators, Nicholas Thomas and Peter Brunt. So I'm going to share here some of what I read then, because this is what decolonization looks like. This is what truth-telling in real time feels like. And it was hard, and it was awkward, and it was painful. Okay. Increasingly, we banter about the term shared authority as evidence of a decolonial museum practice. We see inviting community in to share in the decision-making as progress, and yet we all know that most museums view shared authority as really ceding authority. They perceive it as a loss, that they are relinquishing control over their collections, their exhibitions, and their historical legacy. But we can also think of seed in another way, S-E-E-D, meaning to plant something, to nurture and grow and bear fruit, to be generative. And so how might Oceania be reflected upon in this light? I wish that instead that there had been true collaboration in the curatorial choices, from gallery themes to individual items to how they were interpreted. I wish that instead of intentionally selecting treasures that were freely gifted, that the curators had chosen material that truly embodied and confronted the colonial experience, the introduction of foreign diseases and their devastating impacts. Instead, contemporary works of art were expected to carry the burden of these contested exchanges. I wish the exhibition had addressed historical trauma and its ongoing effects. Instead, we are left with contemporary fears of tsunamis and rising tides. And we, and this included a largely European audience, are thus excused from addressing past harms and the specific and deliberate role European nations had in colonizing, altering, converting, and otherwise destroying indigenous Pacific communities. Left in its place is an exhibition that nonetheless speaks volumes. The power of this exhibit is the persistence of ancestral mana, alongside the realization that those who would most benefit, who most deserve to see that which is gathered here, are absent. Yesterday, a handwritten note was left by the Pacific Islanders before Moai Hava, a guardian who had once stood over a Rapa Nui burial site, his head upturned. We wonder, when was the last time you felt the sun on your face, felt the cool breeze brush across your body, heard the songs of your people? Doing these kinds of interventions require a myriad of indigenous voices, the voices of writers and scholars, artists and activists, not just through public programming and presentations, but during substantive development, decision-making, and implementation. Such a process is not easy. You cannot imagine how much I wrestled with what to say today and how much to say. As both test and testament, this exhibition simultaneously solidifies and strains contemporary relations, just as our original Pacific encounters did centuries ago. So this is what happened after. We hugged, we cried, our relationship survived because it was an honest and truthful exchange that was not meant to disparage, but to seed for our collective future. So I just want to end here with a very short clip. Our repatriation claim with Cambridge University came to a close last year. And so I'd like to share a brief video about that.
So they all were taken without consent, without notification, without discussion. The majority of them were taken during the time of the kingdom. And we've had to practically scour the planet looking at institutions based on what countries were in Hawaii in the early period of contact. Cambridge responded and said they did not have any remains, which wasn't true.
And And if we had just stopped there, you know, and not pursued it anymore, these 20 Iwi Kupuna who have come home now would still be there.
Today we recognize and celebrate aloha, our love for ohana, for family, which is one of the greatest loves of all. It always starts with a request to make our family whole again. We honor you, the leaders of Cambridge University, for your courage to help us heal our kaumaha, our traumatic pain caused by the separation, and our innate desire to seek to return the ancestors to their moiloa, their eternal sleep after more than a century of being disturbed. The significance of this trip for me was that Cambridge University apologized for the actions of its predecessors.
Today's ceremony cannot possibly repair the hurt caused by the extraction of the iwi, but it is a necessary and long-delayed act of justice. It is a sign of our deepest respect for your kupuna. It is a sign of our deepest respect for your culture. It's a sign of our deepest respect for you.
What was very impactful about Cambridge's statement said by their vice chancellor was he actually apologized for the behavior of his ancestors.
And I'm grateful for the opportunity you have given us to repair the damage caused by some of our own ancestors. To your kupuna, I say, I am sorry that your voyage home has been so long interrupted, but I hope that you may now travel back in peace.
Even though this is the 120th repatriation case that we've done, we have no way to gauge how successful we've been because we have no idea how many of them are out there. It's also important to note that it wasn't just institutions that took them, it's private individuals. So hopefully by the end of the summer, they'll be back in the ground.
Thank you.